Welcome to Let It Be. I'm Vanessa, and this is my little corner of music YouTube. Today I'm going to do another episode of Should It Stay or Should It Go, which is my series where I look through albums that I have in my collection to assess whether or not I need to keep them or let them go to a new home where someone may appreciate them more than I do. Usually, what is a candidate for this is albums that I bought maybe on a whim or that I just don't like as much as I thought I would. Or in the case of today, albums I bought taking a bit of a chance without hearing first, and I still haven't got to yet. So I've had them for a while and I just haven't listened to them. So this is my chance to go through them and give them a proper assessment. So the three albums today, because today I'm going to do an artist rather than just one album. So it's the same artist, but three albums. I'm going to be talking about Tim Buckley and his run from the album Lorca to Greetings from LA. Now, I picked these albums up couple years back. There was a online record seller that I bought a lot of records from at that point because they had great selection and great condition, and they were just an awesome seller. But they were sadly going out of business at that point, so they were selling off a lot of their remaining stock really cheap. So I took advantage and bought a big old bunch of records. A lot of things just making snap decisions because they were really like they were like $2 a piece, $1 a piece, like. It was chump change, really. I think shipping cost more than the records. And in that, I got an album that I've got talked about on here before, the Phil Manzanera album that I really liked. So far, that little mission has been successful, but I'm going through a few more albums from that, and in that were these three Tim Buckley albums. Now, I, as I've said a few times on the channel, am a pretty big fan of his son, Jeff Buckley. So I've always been rather curious about him as well. Um, so I'd heard before these going into these albums for this episode, I'd heard the two previous albums in his catalog before this, Blue Afternoon and Happy Sad, and I'd also heard his last two albums in year deep dives, which are a very different direction. So it's I really wanted to take a look at that evolution to see how he got where he ended up in the end in his too short recording career. As well, when I went through this, I decided to check out his first two albums as well. I don't own either of those, but I just wanted to have a complete picture because his career trajectory is quite fascinating. Anyway, into the albums. So first, I'm going to talk about the first one chronologically, which is Lorca, and that came out in 1970. Two of these came out the same year. So prior to this, I've been doing a deep dive of the year 1969 for the past while. So I did get to hear his albums just before this one, Happy, Sad, and Blue Afternoon, which I originally thought going when I first heard this, because I did listen to these a couple times where I hadn't heard them before and where they were rather challenging albums. I had originally thought when I heard this that it was a huge change from those, but when I went back and re-listened to those, I was like, okay, I can kind of see where he was hinting at wanting to go in this direction. But anyway, it is a change. So it's a progression further into a more avant folk and jazz with jazz influences of the previous two albums, starting with the dark and chilling title track. It's noticeably less structured than Blue Afternoon and Happy Sad as well. I've read that this album was Buckley purposely trying to alienate his fans, and it's certainly convincing, as this album very much feels like an artistic statement more than like entertainment. The focus is more on his vocals here and the relatively spare instrumentation. The first side of the album is pretty haunting and really sets a mood. So when we go to the second side and it starts with more of a brighter sounding song with I Had a Talk with My Woman, it is a bit of a relief because it's quite heavy on the first side. And this and Nobody Walking may be the songs that more closely resemble traditional compositions. One thing that really stands out on this album is that his voice and the instruments that you do hear sound great, even if they're not used in a conventional sense. And that is something I can really appreciate and helps give me something to focus on because the songs are so sprawling. They're not they don't follow any kind of traditional structure. So That is something that you have to get used to when you're listening to this. And I can see how it rates highly with people whose enjoyment of music ties in with how experimental and unconventional it is. I feel like something like this would be ideal. And I think that's why this album is quite acclaimed on sites like Rate Your Music, because a lot of the bass there really appreciates that sort of style. So I can see why people love this. But I wouldn't say that I really enjoy it or want to seek it out. It sort of ends up in the camp of albums that I'm glad that I've heard, but I'm not going to end up putting it on any kind of all-time list for myself. So that's sort of where I landed with Lorca. And yeah, as you see, there might it's an interesting journey going through these albums. I'll just say that. So next up, chronologically, we have Star Sailor, which also came out in 1970. Um, this is a weirder album than I ever imagined it being. Even knowing beforehand that it was a more experimental phase for him, I was not expecting the album that I got, I have to say. Um, I'd have to assume that this was a big influence on future post-punk artists. That's something that I really noticed listening to it. It really made me think of that scene in the late 70s, early 80s, and the more artsier side of it, I think really if they heard this album, whether or not I'm not sure, because it was very obscure at the time, so that has to be noted. It was not a success at the time. So I don't know if it was a direct influence on people, but it certainly sounds like one. It really feels like part of that evolution. And it has a pretty similar approach to that kind of songwriting, but it's more jazz based, I think. There's definitely a lot of a free jazz base to this album. Really, it does feel like a blueprint for the artier side of post-punk. But anyway, there is a dark and menacing tone, and but it's also very interesting and well performed. I had no idea what to think of it from my first impression. It was definitely eye-opening to listen to, but it was like it was just like, what? What did I just listen to? I don't know. So I did definitely have to go back to it to really parse out how I felt. Um, I right from the first notes, it's immediately chilling and it makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up like it's like a very visceral album. Like it doesn't you feel it in your body. Like it's very interesting. Much like Lorca, his vocals and the instruments sound really good. But I think despite the fact that this album is even more challenging to listen to than Lorca, somehow it really grabs your attention and becomes almost hypnotic. It ends up falling firmly into that type of album that is more interesting to me than good. I get chills listening to it, but I'm not sure that I want them. It's yeah, it was pretty weird. At times it feels like it almost could veer into like Halloweenish territory, like cartoonish Halloweenish territory, especially on something like the title track. But I do think that the fact that it manages to pull off that unsettling aspect without sounding like a complete cartoon is pretty amazing. Like it doesn't veer too far in that territory, I wouldn't say. More than anything, this and Lorca get me thinking a lot about the line between appreciating something from an artistic or influential perspective and actually enjoying it and what that means to me. I think that ultimately, like Lorca, I was happy to hear something like this in order to assess it for myself, but it's not going to become something I put into my regular rotation as I need to still find enjoyment of music and not just respect. And that I think is the important element. And that is something I struggled with for a long time. I think when I was younger, I would hear something like this and be like, well, I can see how this is really cool and interesting and influential. So I must like it. If I don't like it, what's wrong with me? You know what I mean? But I think now I can take more of a step back and be like, yes, there is lots to appreciate here, and this is really cool, but I don't want to listen to it. Like, I'm sorry, I know that people love this album, but it's not my thing. And I am okay admitting that now, while also still giving it the respect it deserves from an artistic standpoint. So I think that this really gave me a lot to think about this run of albums. And I think that it's interesting just as a kind of a sidebar, because I've been doing a lot of the albums in the 1001 albums You Must Hear Before You Die is just kind of a fun project with some friends. And it's interesting to me that this album isn't in there. I feel like they do have other Tim Buckley albums, but they don't have Star Sailor, which feels like an album that would be sort of tailor-made for something like that. It's unlike a lot of other things, it influenced a lot of people, I think, and it influenced a genre to some degree, or at least the blueprint is there. So I feel like it's something that you should hear whether or not you like it. It is kind of one of those things that you have to experience it at least once, I think. But anyway, so then greetings from LA come, and I cannot think of a bigger heel turn than the one from Star Sailor to Greetings from LA. I knew that too, but it's still very stark when you actually listen to it. I think it was an attempt to be more commercial because obviously, like I said before, these albums were commercial failure, which is understandable. So he was trying to do something because I think didn't have he didn't have the funds. So yeah, it was definitely meant to be a more commercial approach, but it doesn't totally hit the mark on that either. It is a pretty bizarre album in a totally different way. So that aspect, this being a complete heel turn, is again interesting, but this is really not very good. And it is in a completely different way. And without that artistic intrigue of the other two albums, it kind of became a chore to listen to. I didn't enjoy it, and actually, despite the fact that it's got a more of a conventional sound, relatively speaking, than the other two, I actually would say that it's the one I would least want to hear again for any reason. So he starts into this having this tendency to go into kind of a cartoonish singing voice, which is something that he really, I noticed on his last two albums after this, that he does a lot. And it sort of starts here, like he didn't really do it before, so I'm not really sure where that came from. I'm not like a Tim Buckley expert, so maybe there is a story behind that, but it's just something I noticed. And it's just, yeah, it's kind of funny. It makes you kind of giggle a little bit. I mean, he doesn't do it as much on this album as he does in the next two, but it's still noticeable and it still stands out. But I do think his band is pretty tight. As always, he seems to always have good musicians playing with him. But the songs just aren't really that interesting. And everything I noticed seems to be at least a minute longer than it really should be. Like it always felt like the songs just didn't end. So I am not really sure who this would have actually appealed to at the time, even though it was more of an attempt towards being commercial than the other two albums. I just don't really know who would have wanted this. So I can see how it also failed. Anyway, so I usually get into ratings, and I do a lot of rating of music, but I have to say that, especially with Lorca and Star Sailor, I struggle with coming up with a number to put on them because they sort of fall into such a different category than a lot of things. So I would say I've come up with giving them both 3 stars, even though I that's usually what I consider decent. So there's something about it I like, but I don't necessarily like it. Like it doesn't totally come together. Um, so I guess that works for this because there are elements that I think are cool. I think the instruments sound really good at times, even if they're not playing song structures I connect with. It is missing that magic that makes me like something. So it can never go any higher than that, but I can't say that it's horrid either, like that I really necessarily hate it. It's a very weird situation, these two albums, but they are gonna go. I There's no reason for me to keep them. As much as my feelings are complicated and I respect them as albums and all that, there's no reason for me to keep them in my collection. It would just be sort of it's just would be taking up space that should be taken up by something that I actually want to listen to and that I love. Now, Greetings from LA, I'm going to go a little lower on and give it a 2.5 star. I just like I found that one more of a chore to listen to than the other two somehow, which doesn't really make logical sense because it is technically more pleasant, but I just did not enjoy it at all. So that is also going to go, of course. So unfortunately, this experiment into Tim Buckley's discography was a bit of a failure for me. But going back to his other albums, I actually found out that I really love Goodbye and Hello. That would be my favorite album of his, and I hadn't heard that one before, so I'm glad that I checked that one out. I think it's the best combination of his more artsier inclinations with a song based structure that I'm going to enjoy more. So that would be the one album that I would want to own by him, I think, at the end of the day. I did like Happy Sad and Blue Afternoon as well, but not like extensively so. They were more of like in the 3.5 range where I thought they were good, but they're probably not something that is going to be essential for me. So yeah, that is Tim Buckley's discography for me. Um, what do you think of these albums? Have you heard them? Are they something that you enjoy or respect, or do you run far away? Be interested to hear, and also interested to hear what people think about that whole debate of respecting something versus enjoying it. Anyway, till next time, bye.